There are moments in life when what you are facing cannot be explained by ordinary circumstances. Things happen that don't follow normal patterns. Battles appear without clear origin. Opportunities collapse without visible reason. Strength disappears overnight. Peace is disturbed without warning. And if you are not spiritually sensitive, you may call it coincidence. But it is not always coincidence. There is a dimension of life that operates beyond what the eyes can see. A dimension where decisions are influenced, where battles are initiated, where outcomes are shaped before they appear in the physical. And one of the most misunderstood aspects of this reality is the night season. Because the night is not just a time for rest. For many, it is a time when spiritual activities intensify, a time when things are exchanged, a time when decisions are made, a time when invisible forces attempt to influence visible outcomes. This is why you will notice something strange. A person can go to bed fine and wake up completely different. A plan that was clear becomes confused. A body that was strong becomes weak. A mind that was focused becomes heavy. A future that was bright suddenly feels blocked. And the question becomes, what happened in the night? Because not every battle begins in the daytime. Some begin when everything looks quiet, when the body is resting, but the spiritual environment is active. This is why spiritual awareness is critical. Because if you only respond to what happens during the day, you may always be too late. You will be dealing with results instead of addressing the source. And this is where many believers struggle. They pray, but only after something has already gone wrong. They react, but they do not anticipate. They fight, but they do not understand where the battle started. So they keep solving problems without stopping the system that produces the problems. Now listen carefully. There are patterns that only make sense when you begin to consider what happens beyond the visible. For example, why is it that some people experience repeated setbacks right before major breakthroughs? Why do certain opportunities collapse at the final stage? Why do some people experience strange dreams before negative events? Why do some battles seem to intensify during specific hours, especially at night? These are not questions to ignore, because patterns reveal processes and processes reveal systems. And if you understand the system, you can begin to interrupt it. Now, this is not about fear. This is about awareness. Because fear weakens, but awareness strengthens. Awareness helps you stop being passive. It helps you stop accepting everything as normal. It helps you begin to ask, what is really going on here? Because once you ask the right question, you position yourself for the right response. Now here is the truth. There is what could be called the hour of darkness. Not just darkness as absence of light, but darkness as activity. A period where certain negative influences are more aggressive, where certain patterns are reinforced, where certain attacks are initiated. And if a person is completely unaware of this dimension, they may unknowingly become vulnerable. Not because they are weak, but because they are unaware. This is why spiritual life cannot be shallow, it cannot be casual, it cannot be something you only engage when convenient, because the forces that affect life are not always casual. They are intentional, they are strategic, and they are consistent. So your response must also be intentional, strategic, consistent. Now here is something deeper. The goal is not just to know that these things exist. The goal is to understand how do they affect you and how do you respond effectively. Because awareness without response leads to frustration, but awareness with strategy leads to transformation. This is where everything begins. Not with panic, not with confusion, but with clarity. Clarity that says, I may not see everything, but I will not ignore what is affecting my life. Clarity that says, I refuse to remain passive in the face of repeated patterns. Clarity that says, if something is influencing my life from a place I cannot see, then I will learn how to respond at that level. And once that clarity is established, you are no longer just reacting to life. You are beginning to understand it. And this is where the real journey starts. Because now the question becomes, if the night represents a time of hidden activity, what exactly operates in that dimension? And how does it gain access to people's lives? If the night is a time of heightened activity, then the next question is unavoidable. What actually operates in that dimension? Because you cannot confront what you do not understand, and you cannot break what you cannot identify. This is where many people remain stuck. They feel the effect, but they don't understand the source. They sense resistance, but they cannot define it. They experience patterns, but they don't know what is behind them. And because of that, their response remains general, while the problem remains specific. Now listen carefully. The night is often a time where hidden influences become active, not always visible, not always dramatic, but active. And these influences operate in different ways. Some operate through subtle interference. They don't destroy immediately. They weaken gradually. They introduce confusion. They reduce clarity. They drain motivation. They create heaviness. So a person wakes up and cannot explain why they feel tired without reason, discouraged without cause, distracted without intention. Nothing dramatic happened, but something shifted. Other influences operate through patterns of disruption. These are the ones that target key moments, right before progress, right before opportunity, right before breakthrough. Something goes wrong, not randomly, but consistently. And when you observe closely, you begin to see a pattern. It is not that nothing works, it is that things don't last. Now, there are also influences that operate through internal suggestion. This is very important. Not every battle is external. Some are introduced internally. Thoughts that don't align, fears that suddenly appear, doubts that feel stronger than usual. And if a person is not aware, they may assume this is just me, but sometimes it is not just you. It is something attempting to shape your thinking, because once thinking is influenced, direction can be controlled. Now here is where it becomes deeper. Some influences operate through what could be called access points. Not everything enters randomly. Sometimes there are openings created by repeated negative thinking, unresolved emotional patterns, unhealthy environments, lack of spiritual awareness, inconsistency in discipline. And once an opening exists, something can attach itself to that pattern. Not permanently, but persistently. And the longer it remains unchallenged, the stronger it appears. Now, understand this clearly. This is not about blaming everything on unseen forces. Personal responsibility still matters. Choices still matter. Habits still matter. But ignoring the spiritual dimension entirely creates blind spots. And blind spots make people vulnerable. Now, here is something very important. Not all activity in the night is destructive, but destructive patterns often take advantage of the night because of reduced awareness. When the body is resting, the mind is less guarded. When the environment is quiet, subtle influences are less resisted. And if there is no intentional spiritual alignment, that period becomes unguarded time. This is why many traditions emphasize intentional prayer or reflection before rest. Not as ritual, but as alignment. Because alignment closes unnecessary openings. It strengthens awareness. It stabilizes the mind. And it reduces vulnerability. Now, here is a key truth. What affects you repeatedly is something that must be addressed intentionally. You cannot ignore it. You cannot normalize it. You cannot keep explaining it away, because repetition is a signal that something is operating consistently, and consistency on one side requires consistency on the other side. This is where many people fail. They respond occasionally to something that is operating continuously, so the imbalance remains. Now imagine this. If something has been influencing your life at specific times, and you begin to respond intentionally at those same times, you begin to interrupt the pattern. You begin to meet the activity at the level where it operates. And this is where things start to change. Not instantly always, but progressively. Because now you are no longer reacting late. You are responding at the source level. Now this leads to a very important realization. It is not enough to just be aware of these influences. You must learn how to close unnecessary access points, stabilize your internal state, develop consistent spiritual alignment, respond intentionally, not randomly, because randomness cannot defeat consistency. Now the next question becomes critical. If these influences operate through patterns, access points and timing, how do you begin to actively resist them and take back control of your life? Because awareness is only the beginning. The real shift happens when you move from understanding to intentional action. If awareness shows you that something is happening, then action determines whether it continues. Because understanding alone does not break patterns. Recognition alone does not stop cycles. There must be a point where you move from I see it to I am confronting it. Now this is where things begin to shift, because many people remain observers of their own struggles. They can describe the problem, they can explain the pattern, they can even predict when it might happen again, but they are not actively interrupting it. And anything you do not interrupt eventually becomes established. Now listen carefully. There is a difference between struggle and bondage, habit and pattern, delay and resistance. A struggle can be temporary, a habit can be changed, a delay can be natural, but when something becomes a pattern, it is no longer casual. It has structure, it has repetition, and sometimes it has reinforcement. That is when passive response is no longer enough. Now here is where spiritual discipline comes in, not as routine, but as intentional positioning. Because you are not just living life randomly. You are positioning yourself against what is working against you. This is why prayer must be understood correctly. Prayer is not decoration. Prayer is not background activity. Prayer is not something you do only when you feel like it. Prayer is engagement. It is where alignment happens. It is where clarity is restored. It is where resistance is activated. But here is the problem. Many people pray, but they pray casually about serious matters. They approach deep patterns with shallow consistency. They expect strong outcomes from weak engagements. And when nothing changes, they become discouraged. But the issue is not always the absence of efforts. It is the absence of focused, intentional effort. Now think about this. If a pattern has been repeating in your life for years, why would it respond to one moment of attention if something has been reinforced consistently? Why would it collapse under occasional resistance? This is why persistence matters. Not emotional persistence, but disciplined persistence. Now here is something deeper. Action begins with internal alignment. Because before you confront anything externally, you must stabilize internally. If your thoughts are scattered, your response will be weak. If your emotions are unstable, your consistency will break. If your focus is divided, your effort will lose direction. So the first level of action is bringing your inner state into alignment. This means becoming aware of your thoughts, rejecting what does not align with truth, reinforcing what strengthens your clarity, refusing to agree with negativity that weakens you, because agreement matters. What you consistently agree with internally eventually shapes your external reality. Now, once internal alignment is established, external action becomes effective. This is where intentional prayer, reflection, and discipline come together, not as random acts, but as targeted engagement. For example, instead of waiting for a pattern to repeat, you begin to respond before it manifests. Instead of reacting to outcomes, you address the conditions that produce them. Instead of being surprised, you become prepared. Now, here is a key question. Are you responding to your life, or are you directing it? Because there is a difference. Response is reactive. Direction is intentional. And direction requires consistency. Now, this does not mean everything changes overnight, but it means something important. The pattern is no longer unchallenged. And once a pattern is consistently challenged, it begins to weaken. Now, here is something many people overlook. Sometimes the reason a pattern continues is because it has never been confronted with clarity and authority. It has been tolerated, explained, excused, ignored, but not directly challenged. And what is tolerated often grows. What is ignored often strengthens. What is excused often repeats. So there must be a moment where you say, this pattern stops here. Not emotionally, but intentionally. Not once, but consistently. Now here is where the shift becomes real. When your awareness is clear, your alignment is stable, and your action is consistent, you begin to see something change. Not just externally, but internally. You become less reactive, more focused, more grounded, more intentional. And from that position, you are no longer easily influenced. Now the next step becomes even more important, because once you begin to act intentionally, you must also learn how to discern deeper patterns, not just what is happening, but why it keeps happening. Because if you address the symptom, but ignore the root, the pattern may return in a different form. So the next question is this: what are the deeper roots behind repeated struggles, and how do you identify them clearly? If a pattern keeps repeating, then it is no longer just an event, it is a rooted system. And until the root is addressed, the outcome will continue. Even if the form changes, this is where many people become confused. They celebrate temporary relief, but ignore the deeper cause. They fix what is visible, but leave untouched what is producing it. And so the cycle returns. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the same way, but it returns. Now listen carefully. There is a difference between removing a symptom and uprooting a source. A symptom is what you feel, a source is what produces it. A symptom can be temporary, a source is sustained. So if your focus is only on symptoms, your victories will always be temporary. Now, this is where spiritual discernment becomes essential. Because not every issue is surface level. Some things are connected to deep internal patterns, long-standing agreements, unexamined beliefs, repeated emotional cycles, and sometimes even influences that have been present for a long time become normalized. You stop questioning them. You stop resisting them. You begin to live around them. And what should have been challenged becomes accepted. Now, here is a hard but necessary truth. Not every struggle is imposed. Some are sustained. Sustained by repeated thinking patterns, unaddressed behaviors, lack of discipline, avoidance of truth. And if you are not honest about this, you may keep fighting externally what is being reinforced internally. This is why self-examination is not optional. It is necessary because clarity begins with truth. Now ask yourself, are there patterns in my life that I have stopped questioning? Are there cycles I have learned to live with instead of confront? Have I mistaken familiarity for normality? Because familiarity can be deceptive. Just because something has been there for a long time does not mean it belongs there. Now, here is where it becomes deeper. Some patterns are not just personal, they are inherited tendencies, not necessarily in a mystical sense, but in the form of learned behaviors, observed responses, repeated family dynamics, ways of thinking, ways of reacting, ways of handling pressure that have been passed down unconsciously. And if they are not examined, they are repeated. Now, this is not about blame. It is about awareness. Because once you see it clearly, you can choose differently. Now, here is something critical. Every pattern has a point of entry, a place where it began, a moment where it was allowed, a situation where it was reinforced, and if you can identify that point, you can begin to disconnect from it. Now, this requires honesty, not surface level honesty, but deep, uncomfortable clarity, because sometimes the root is not external opposition, but internal agreement with fear, limitation, negativity, passivity. An agreement gives permission. Now imagine this. If something has been operating in your life and part of you has been unknowingly agreeing with it, then breaking that agreement becomes a turning point. Because once agreement is withdrawn, influence weakens. Now this is where intentional spiritual action becomes powerful. Because you are no longer just reacting to events, you are disconnecting from the system that produces them. Now here is the next layer. Roots are not always obvious. They hide behind emotions, distractions, excuse, justification. So discernment requires stillness. It requires reflection. It requires asking deeper questions like, why does this keep happening? When did this pattern begin? What triggers it? What part of me is allowing it to continue? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary because clarity exposes what confusion protects. Now, once the root is identified, action becomes precise. You are no longer fighting blindly. You are addressing the exact point of influence. And this is where real change begins. Not dramatic, but structural. Not emotional, but intentional. Now, here is something very important. Uprooting a pattern is not a one-time event. It is a process. A process of awareness, alignment, inconsistent action, reinforcement of new patterns. Because once something is removed, something else must replace it. Otherwise, the space remains open. Now, this leads to the next critical step. If roots must be removed and new patterns must be established, what role does consistent spiritual discipline play in sustaining long-term transformation? Because starting is one thing, but sustaining change is another. If a pattern has been uprooted, but nothing replaces it, then the space it occupied does not remain empty for long. It becomes available again, and what was removed can quietly return, sometimes in a different form, sometimes with greater subtlety. This is why transformation is not just about removal, it is about replacement and reinforcement. Now listen carefully. Many people experience moments of clarity, moments where they see what has been wrong, moments where they feel ready to change, moments where something shifts internally. But after that moment, there is no structure, no discipline, no consistency. And without structure, clarity fades. Without consistency, change weakens. Without discipline, old patterns quietly return. Now, this is where spiritual discipline becomes essential, not as pressure, but as protection. Because discipline is what stabilizes transformation. It is what turns a moment into a lifestyle. It is what keeps progress from collapsing. Now, here is the truth. You cannot build a strong life on occasional effort. You cannot maintain clarity with inconsistent attention. You cannot sustain change with emotional bursts. There must be rhythm. There must be structure. There must be intention. Now, when we talk about discipline in this context, we are not talking about empty routine. We are talking about intentional practices that align your life daily. Practices that strengthen your awareness, stabilize your thinking, reinforce your direction, protect your focus. Because every day, something is influencing you through information, conversation, environment, internal thoughts. And if you are not intentional, you will be shaped by whatever is most consistent around you. Now, here is a critical question. What is shaping your daily life? Because whatever is shaping you is also directing you. Now, spiritual discipline is what ensures that your direction is not accidental. It becomes intentional. It becomes guided. It becomes stable. Now, let's make this practical. Discipline in this context looks like consistency in reflection, taking time to examine your thoughts, your responses, your direction, consistency in alignment, realigning your thinking with truth instead of reacting to emotions, consistency in intentional prayer or focus, not as ritual, but as engagement, consistency in guarding your internal environment, being selective about what you allow to influence your mind. Because if your internal environment is unstable, your external efforts will not hold. Now, here is something deeper. Discipline is not always comfortable. It requires saying no to distraction, passivity, inconsistency. It requires choosing focus over convenience, clarity over comfort, growth over familiarity. And this is where many people struggle. Because transformation often requires leaving behind what feels normal, even if what feels normal is what has been limiting you. Now, understand this clearly. Discipline is not punishment. It is alignment over time. It is choosing repeatedly what supports your direction. And over time, those repeated choices become your new pattern. Now, here is where it becomes powerful. When discipline becomes consistent, your life becomes less reactive. You are not easily shaken. You are not easily distracted. You are not easily influenced because your internal state is stable. Now, stability changes everything because instability makes you vulnerable, but stability makes you resilient. Now, here is a key insight. What you practice consistently, you eventually become. If you practice distraction, you become unfocused. If you practice fear, you become hesitant. If you practice clarity and alignment, you become grounded. So the question is not just, what am I dealing with? The deeper question is, what am I practicing daily? Because your daily practice is shaping your future. Now this leads to something very important. Even with discipline, even with awareness, there will still be moments of resistance. Moments where things feel harder than expected. Moments where progress seems slow. Moments where opposition feels stronger. And this is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They think maybe it's not working. But sometimes resistance increases because something is being disrupted. And disruption often creates reaction. So the next question becomes, when resistance shows up, how do you stay steady, focused, and effective without falling back into old patterns? Because this is where many transformations are either sustained or lost. When resistance increases, it does not always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it means something is changing, and anything that disrupts an established pattern will often be resisted. Now, this is where many people misinterpret their situation. They begin to make progress, they become more aware, they start to act intentionally, and then suddenly things feel harder. Old thoughts try to return, old emotions resurface, old patterns attempt to reestablish themselves, and the immediate conclusion becomes, maybe I'm going backward. But that is not always true. Sometimes you are not going backward, you are encountering what has not yet fully released its hold. Now listen carefully. There is a difference between failure and resistance. Failure stops movement, resistance challenges movement, and if you cannot tell the difference, you may stop at the very moment you should continue. Now, here is something important. When a pattern has existed for a long time, it does not disappear quietly. It has momentum, it has familiarity, it has reinforcement. So when you begin to break away from it, there is often a reaction. That reaction can show up as intensified thoughts, increased distraction, emotional pressure, sudden discouragement. Not because you are weak, but because something is losing influence. And loss of influence often creates resistance. Now, this is where stability becomes critical. Because in moments of resistance, you must not rely on emotion. You must rely on decision. Emotion fluctuates, decision anchors. Now ask yourself, when things become difficult, do I return to what is familiar? Or do I stay aligned with what I have chosen? Because that choice determines everything. Now, here is a key truth. Consistency during easy moments is common, but consistency during resistance is what produces transformation. Now, this requires something deeper than motivation. It requires conviction. Conviction that says, I'm not going back to what I've already identified as limiting. I will not abandon clarity because of temporary pressure. I will not exchange long-term transformation for short-term comfort. Now, understand this. Resistance often targets your focus. Because if your focus is broken, your direction weakens. So one of the most important things you can do is to protect your attention. Guard what you think about. Be intentional about what you dwell on. Refuse to entertain thoughts that pull you backward. Now, this does not mean ignoring reality. It means choosing what you agree with, because again, agreement matters. What you repeatedly agree with, you reinforce. Now, here is something deeper. There will be moments where progress feels invisible, where you are doing the right things, but you don't immediately see results. And this is where many people give up, because they expect visible change before internal transformation is complete. But real change often begins internally, quietly, gradually, before it becomes visible. Now think about this. If a pattern has been shaping your life for years, would it be realistic for everything to shift instantly? Sometimes yes, but often it is a process, and processes require patience. Now, patience is not passive. Patience is active consistency without immediate reward. It is continuing to act in alignment even when results are not yet obvious. Now, here is where strength is built. Not when everything is easy, but when you continue despite resistance. Now, understand this clearly. You do not need to fight everything emotionally. You need to remain aligned consistently, because alignment over time is stronger than occasional intensity. Now, here is a powerful shift. When you stop reacting emotionally to resistance and start responding intentionally, resistance loses its control over you because it can no longer dictate your behavior. Now, this is where many people experience breakthrough, not when resistance disappears, but when it no longer controls them. Now ask yourself, am I reacting to resistance or am I remaining aligned through it? Because that answer determines whether the pattern continues or finally breaks. Now, as we come toward the final part of this journey, there is one last thing that must be established. Because awareness has been built, alignment has been strengthened, discipline has been introduced, resistance has been understood. But all of these must lead to something clear. What does a transformed life actually look like when these principles are consistently applied? Because transformation is not just about breaking patterns, it is about becoming someone who no longer lives under them. When transformation is real, it is not just seen in what has stopped. It is revealed in what has changed within you. Because the goal was never only to break patterns. The goal was to become someone who is no longer governed by them. Now, this is where everything comes together. A transformed life is not a life without challenges. It is a life where challenges no longer have automatic control. It is a life where awareness replaces confusion, alignment replaces instability, discipline replaces inconsistency, conviction replaces hesitation. And because of that, you are no longer easily moved. Now, listen carefully. Transformation is not loud. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. It is seen in how you think, how you respond, how you decide, how you remain steady. It is seen in the fact that what used to shake you no longer shakes you. What used to control you no longer controls you. What used to repeat no longer finds space. Now here is something important. A transformed life is a guarded life. Not guarded in fear, but guarded in awareness. You become intentional about what you allow into your mind, what you agree with internally, what you tolerate consistently, because you now understand something you did not fully understand before. Not everything deserves access to your life. Now this changes your decisions. You no longer entertain everything. You no longer absorb everything. You no longer normalize what should be questioned, because you have seen what happens when awareness is absent. Now here is another shift. A transformed life is a directed life. You are no longer drifting. You are no longer reacting to everything that happens. You are choosing your direction intentionally. And because of that, your life becomes more stable. Not perfect, but stable. Now, stability is powerful because stability allows growth, and growth produces strength. Now, here is something deeper. A transformed life is also a responsible life. You stop blaming everything externally. You take ownership of your alignment. You take responsibility for your consistency. You take responsibility for your decisions. Not because everything is your fault, but because your response is your responsibility. And that changes everything. Now, here is a key truth. Freedom is not just the absence of pressure. Freedom is the ability to remain aligned even when pressure exists. Now, this is where many people misunderstand transformation. They think if everything is not perfect, then nothing has changed. But that is not true. Real change is seen in how you respond, not just in what you experience. Now, as you reflect on everything that has been said, consider this. Are there patterns in your life that you now see more clearly? Are there areas where you have been reacting instead of responding intentionally? Are there influences you have allowed without questioning them? Because awareness creates responsibility, and responsibility creates opportunity. Now, here is the final thought. Life is not spiritually neutral. There are influences, there are patterns. There are systems at work, some visible, some not. And ignoring that reality does not protect you. But understanding it positions you. Now you have a choice to remain passive or to become intentional, to keep reacting or to start directing, to continue repeating patterns or to begin transforming them. And that choice is not made once. It is made daily, through your awareness, through your alignment, through your discipline, through your response. Now, this is not about fear. It is about clarity. Clarity that leads to action. Clarity that leads to stability. Clarity that leads to transformation. And if you choose to walk in that clarity, then what once controlled your life will no longer define it. Stay aware, stay aligned, stay consistent, and let your life reflect the fact that you are no longer living unconsciously, but intentionally.